embedded interaction that India can have with these regimes and with the countries that are members of these regimes. India is fairly high on the technology production and capability ladder, and therefore the countries that India really needs to deal with are the United States, West Europe, Japan, Russia, China, and so forth, who are in fact members of these regimes, and that's why we need to pay attention to them. So that's framing the bigger aspect of how India interacts with these regimes. I'll also list for you a few that are relevant for India. These are guidelines that come out of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. As you know, we are one of the, not the founding, but we joined this regime very early on, 1957-58. We serve on the board of governors of this regime. India has contributed a very large technical staff that become part of IAEA inspection missions around the world. And we also contribute, at least amongst the developing countries, financially quite a bit of money to IAEA, and we are in very good standing with them, given the 40+ years of our nuclear reactors that have been under safeguards. We submit a national report each year, the IAEA reports, which are public, you can read, provide India exemplary record in safety and transparency, accountability, and things like that. So you have an inspection regime that looks after the nuclear side of things. You have OPCW that looks after inspection on the chemical side of things, but you don't have parallel bodies on the missile side or on the biological side. On the IAEA side, you have a host of conventions and binding guidelines which deal with physical protection of nuclear materials. Since I don't have the PowerPoint capability, I'm just compressing a lot of what we had intended to discuss. You also have a number of international conventions that deal with nuclear terrorism. Our first speaker will be talking in length actually about them, so I'll skip them in the interest of giving him more time to discuss them. But these are, two of them at least, are internationally binding UN regulations that enjoin upon India as well the obligations to legislate and control for any proliferation to non-state actors and terrorists. You then have a number of initiatives around the world, not only to combat nuclear terrorism, but when we talk about proliferation, what we are talking about is a set of regulations in a country so that all items that are high technology items require a license from a government's national authority. They then go through the national customs after you produce your license and all the safeguards, and then it goes on to a transportation vessel, a ship, a land vessel, an aircraft. If that customs border guard has not been able to stop it, then proliferation is already in progress. So then what you do before it reaches its destination is see if you can interdict that shipment. There are initiatives that have come up since in the last few years. One of them is called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is designed precisely to address that challenge. When proliferation is in progress, how do you interdict this? And it comes into heavy legal issues like, can you intercept in high seas, or do you have to respect the right of innocent passage in the international waters? For now, the simple agreement they have come to is, let's wait until the ship actually comes into the territorial waters of any of the participating countries, and then we have the requisite legal authority to intercept. You have parallel things that are looking at the global supply chain security. One of them is called the Container Security Initiative, which requires participating countries to have ports with technical safeguards and other features that ensure that items are screened before they come onto the ship. The containers itself are now with RFID chips and a multitude of security features that are built into it. So it's a cradle-to-grave security from the time where it was produced in a manufacturing yard to the loading onto the vessel, vehicle, taken to the customs port, loading onto the ship, freight forwarding if it had gone through on a ship which docked in different places where there was transit or transshipment cargo, finally reaching its destination and then reaching its end user. I'm just sketching out for you the various sides of this challenge that countries are responding to, and therefore you have an initiative called the Container Security Initiative. There is an adjunct to that which is called the Customs Trade Partnership, which is a partnership between all the major manufacturing companies of the world and the customs unions of their countries on the companies taking on the onus of providing security during the production, packing and distribution of your product. So the more the companies are able to self-police themselves, the less the government has to play the role of a policeman. So you can facilitate trade by doing those things. We can talk about some of those things. And back to the global level, you have a G8 global partnership, and you have a number of other initiatives coming up, including the creation of a global nuclear fuel bank, so that in Iran, for example, if it wants to pursue a nuclear energy option, one of the options being offered to Iran is, rather than you're spending the next 20 years to produce energy which will be probably 4.5 times the cost at which you are currently selling fossil fuel energy in your own country, why don't you receive from the global fuel bank low enriched uranium as an energy supply? You use it, it is available to you at a competitive rate. Use it, the spent fuel is taken back, it is reprocessed, sent back to you, and therefore the risk of diversion toward a weapons program is eliminated. So you have options like that that are out there. Let me actually stop here, and there are a few other things that I'll introduce into our discussion, but that goes more toward implementation. And let me introduce our first speaker to you. Dr. B. Siddhartha, to my left, has 30 plus years of very distinguished service across what we call the strategic Trimurti in India, the Department of Atomic Energy, Space, and DRDO. I think this audience knows what these entities are. The longest, about 18 years at the DRDO? 20. Siddharth comes with a very rich educational background in laser and high energy physics, has applied them in various capacities in very senior ranks across these three agencies, has represented the government of India and been part of task forces in international missions, including to the United Nations. After having served with distinction as an advisor to the scientific advisor in DRDO, he then served for a year and a half as an advisor to the Ministry of External Affairs, and then for 2 years was part of the UN Security Council. There is a resolution 1540 that Siddhartha will be describing to you, which was created in 2004. It has an experts committee attached to it to help implement the obligations of 1540. So he served in New York for a couple of years on that and got back earlier this year in April, and is now serving as an advisor in this building, actually, to the principal scientific advisor to the Raksha Mantri. So it gives me great pleasure to not only claim his friendship, but to ask Siddhartha to explain to you how the United Nations is looking at the challenges, not just nuclear but beyond. What are the treaties that operate in this space and its implications for India, and then we'll go on to the financial.
Thank you very much, Anupam. Excuse me. Facing this very distinguished audience with some trepidation. I'm in the company of lawyers, and I better be very careful what I say, lest I be arrested as I go on. Allow me, therefore, to. How much time do I have? Okay. Good. If I have that much time, and if I can hold your attention for that long, allow me. So I'm speaking to a subject called the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, 1540, which was passed in 2004 by the United Nations Security Council. Security Council resolutions are numbered sequentially and indefinitely, so that it's not year by year, it's just sequentially numbered. This particular one happens to be 1540. And the attempt of 1540 was an effort by the United Nations to make non-proliferation practices universal across all countries, whether or not they are or were or will be members of the regimes that Anupam talked about. The mandatoriness of the resolutions, these resolutions, there are actually 3 of them, I come to that in a minute, but in respect to 1540, it becomes mandatory, and there's a certain element of why it is mandatory and so on. I'll come to that as well. It was adopted under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Security Council, Chapter 7 of the United Nations Resolution, and when a United Nations Charter, and when a resolution of the Security Council is adopted under Chapter 7, then it becomes mandatory on all the countries, member countries of the United Nations. At the extent of mandatoriness, etc., I will come to in a short while. Now, why was it necessary for the United Nations Security Council to evolve, so to speak, this resolution 1540? And apart from the fact that it was necessary to make it universal. See, the trend in international trade was to free this trade from governmental controls of any kind. And when you have, in effect, free trade, quote unquote, that is free of physical barriers as distinct from tariff barriers, separate. In other words, you are permitted to export subject to the condition, or in other words, you can export without governmental permission, subject to the condition that you pay the necessary taxes and so on. This regime of free trade had been in force for quite some time, essentially as a result of the UNCTAD and subsequently the WTO regulations that all of you know about. So one of the things that this had unintended consequences. It made trade in dangerous weapons also free. And it also eased trade in goods and expertise, particularly the expertise that were usable to make or use these kinds of weapons. No? And it made it easier for terrorists and other non-state actors, that are actors which are not authorized by the state, to access these goods and expertise without the knowledge and control of governments. Now, the most famous example, an egregious example, right here in our neighborhood, is of course Pakistan. The A.Q. Khan network, which all of you know about by reading in the newspapers. It's a notorious network. And 1540, UN Security Council Resolution 1540, was a direct result of the A.Q. Khan network and the realization, particularly after so-called 9/11, actually 11/9, excuse me, that in the event that these people who slammed their aircraft into those 2 towers in New York, if they had had weapons of mass destruction, which are essentially ABC weapons, they're called ABC, atomic, biological, chemical, or NBC sometimes, then the potential for destruction on a very massive scale was very large, and that therefore, since these people were acting outside the control of governments, it became necessary to have an international regime to which all countries signed up or were forced into, which prevented the proliferation not only of the weapons themselves, but also the means by which these weapons could be made, including the knowledge. As you know, that A.Q. Khan, one of the other things that he did was to trade in the knowledge to make centrifuges which would then go about capable of enriching uranium to weapons grade. Then what happened was, you have to give teeth to the national, everybody says, you know, we're committed to non-proliferation. Well, yes, that was a verbal statement, but you had to give teeth to that, and therefore it was equally important to ensure that businesses within countries, which are out to make profits after all, that's why they exist, particularly in the export market, private or public, are not helping others, third parties, within or outside the borders of the country in which they are located, to build weapons of mass destruction knowingly or unknowingly. So, amongst the very many UN resolutions, UN Security Council Resolution 1540 has a very special significance. Excuse me. It was adopted, as I had mentioned earlier, and by the Security Council under Chapter 7, and therefore it is mandatory for all members of the United Nations to implement it. Of course, no members can opt out.